The moment Elena Ashford stood up from her chair at the dinner table, the entire room fell silent, and her husband didn't even notice. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from respect or anticipation. It was the suffocating quiet that follows something unforgivable, something that cannot be unsaid or undone. 50 of the world's most powerful people sat frozen around the elongated mahogany table, their champagne glasses suspended mid-air, their perfectly practiced smiles cracking like porcelain. But Julian Ashford, seated at the head of that endless table in his custom Brioni suit, was still leaning toward the blonde investor on his right, whispering something that made her laugh, that practiced flirtatious laugh that Elena had heard 1,000 times before, directed at 1,000 different women. He hadn't looked at his wife in 3 hours. Not when she arrived at the party in the dress he'd never seen her wear. Not when she took her assigned seat 23 chairs away from him, wedged between a tech mogul who spent the entire appetizer course talking to the person on his other side and an elderly oil baron who'd fallen asleep before the salad arrived. Not when she sat there, fork resting untouched beside her plate, watching her husband play the role he'd perfected, the charming billionaire, the visionary entrepreneur, the man everyone wanted to know, the man who'd forgotten she existed. But now she was standing, and even though Julian still hadn't turned his head, everyone else had. Because Elena wasn't simply standing, she was transformed. Something in her posture, in the set of her shoulders, in the way she looked down the impossible length of that table toward her husband, carried a weight that made the crystal chandeliers seem to dim. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. And finally Julian looked at her. 6 years earlier, Elena had believed in fairy tales. Not the Disney kind with singing animals and magic pumpkins, but the adult version, the one where a brilliant, driven man sees something special in you that nobody else has noticed. Where love grows from intellectual connection and mutual respect. Where partnership means building something together, side by side, equal in every way that matters. She'd met Julian at a charity gala in Boston, back when she was still Dr. Elena Reyes, a behavioral psychologist who just published her first book on emotional intelligence in leadership. She'd been invited to speak on a panel about empathy in corporate culture, a topic that most of the attendees pretended to care about for exactly as long as it took to get their photo op and tax deduction. But Julian had stayed for the entire panel. He'd asked thoughtful questions. He'd read her book, actually read it, not just skimmed the summary his assistant had prepared. When he'd approached her afterward, he hadn't led with his net worth or his company's valuation. He'd asked about her research, about her theories on authentic connection in an increasingly digital world. "I think you're describing something I've been searching for my entire life," he told her. Over coffee that stretched into dinner, that stretched into a walk along the Charles River at midnight. Real connection. The kind where you're actually seen. She'd fallen in love with his vulnerability that night. The way he admitted he was lonely despite being surrounded by people constantly. The way he talked about building his company not just for profit, but for purpose, for creating something meaningful. The way he looked at her like she was the first person who'd ever truly understood him. They were married within a year. The wedding had been small, intimate, exactly what Elena wanted. Julian's business associates had been surprised. They'd expected a spectacle, something to match his status, but he'd insisted on keeping it private. "This is about us," he'd whispered to her the morning of their wedding. "Not them." Never them. For the first 2 years, he'd kept that promise. They traveled together, not to his business meetings, but to places she wanted to explore, small villages in Portugal, where she could practice her research on community dynamics, meditation retreats in Thailand, where they disconnected from his empire completely. He'd read her papers, offered insights from his own experience leading thousands of employees, challenged her thinking in ways that made her work better. "You make me want to be more than just successful," he'd told her one night in Bali, the ocean crashing beyond their villa. "You make me want to be good." She'd believed him completely. The shift had been gradual, so subtle she almost hadn't noticed it at first. A canceled dinner here, a business trip extended there. He stopped reading her drafts. He stopped asking about her day. When she'd speak at conferences, he'd send flowers but wouldn't attend. When her second book was published to critical acclaim, he'd been in Dubai, closing a deal he'd sworn was crucial. "I'm building something for us," he'd explain whenever she brought it up. His voice tinged with the patience one uses with a child who doesn't understand adult responsibilities. "For our future, you want me to be successful, don't you?" It was a question designed to have only one acceptable answer, so Elena had adjusted. She'd learned to eat dinner alone in their cavernous penthouse, the city lights of Manhattan glittering below like a galaxy she couldn't quite reach. She'd learned to sleep in a bed that felt vast and empty, even when he was technically in it, his back turned to her, his phone glowing in the darkness as he responded to messages from people who apparently needed him more than she did. She'd learned to smile at events where people introduced her as Julian Ashford's wife, never by her own name, never acknowledging her doctorate or her work or the 3 books she'd published, just an appendage. A pretty accessory to match his expensive watch and his vintage car collection. "Mrs. Ashford, you must be so proud of your husband's latest acquisition," they'd say. And she'd nod and smile and swallow the words that wanted to claw their way out of her throat. "I used to be someone too. I used to matter." The real breaking point had come 4 months ago. Elena had been invited to give the keynote speech at the International Psychology Conference in Geneva, a massive honor, the kind of recognition that most researchers spend their entire careers hoping for. She'd worked on her presentation for weeks, crafting it carefully, knowing it would be attended by the world's leading experts in her field. She told Julian about it over breakfast one morning, her excitement barely contained. "It's in 6 weeks, she'd said, pulling up the conference website on her tablet to show him. "They're flying me first class, putting me up at the Mandarin Oriental. And Julian, the theme is exactly what I've been researching, the intersection of technology and human connection." "It's perfect." He'd glanced at the screen for perhaps 3 seconds. "That's great, honey," he'd said, his attention already back on his own tablet, scrolling through emails. "When did you say it was?" "September 10th through the 13th, a pause. Then, "Oh, that won't work." She'd felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What do you mean?" "We have the Catalyst Summit that week. I need you there." The Catalyst Summit was Julian's company's annual event, a massive production where he unveiled new products, announced partnerships, and essentially held court for 3 days while investors and media fawned over him. Elena had attended the previous 2 years, both times sitting in the front row, applauding on cue, playing the supportive wife role to perfection. "Julian, this is my keynote. My career. And Catalyst is mine." He'd said it so simply, as if the comparison was obvious and fair. "Elena, there will be other conferences. This summit happens once a year, and the optics of you not being there." "Optics?" "Yes, optics. People notice. They talk. Where's Mrs. Ashford? Is everything okay with their marriage? I can't have that distraction during the most important week of our fiscal year." She'd stared at him, this man she'd married, this man who'd once told her he valued her mind above everything else. "So you want me to cancel my keynote speech, the biggest professional opportunity of my career, so that I can sit in the audience and smile while you talk about profit margins?" He'd finally looked up from his tablet then, and what she'd seen in his eyes was worse than anger. It was surprise. Genuine confusion that she was even questioning this. "Elena, be reasonable. Your little psychology talks are lovely, but let's be honest about priorities here. My company employs 15,000 people. The decisions I make affect the economy. This isn't about what I want, it's about what makes sense. Your little psychology talks. Your little psychology talks." Those 4 words had shattered something inside her that she hadn't known could break. She'd gone to Geneva anyway. She'd given her speech to a standing ovation, had been approached by 3 major universities offering research positions, had been interviewed by the BBC and CNN. It had been one of the most validating, empowering experiences of her life. Julian hadn't called even once during the entire conference. When she'd returned to their penthouse, she'd found him in his office, on a video call, laughing at something one of his vice presidents had said. He'd waved at her absently, the gesture one might use for a housekeeper, and continued his meeting. That night, she'd lain awake beside his sleeping form and realized with crystalline clarity she had become invisible in her own marriage. The invitation to the Ashford Foundation Gala had arrived 6 weeks ago, embossed in gold, ridiculously ostentatious. Julian's company was celebrating its 20th anniversary, and he'd decided to throw a party that would cement his legacy. Those were his exact words. "I want everyone there," he'd announced at one of the rare dinners they'd shared. "Every major player in tech, finance, entertainment. I've already got confirmations from 3 senators and a former president. This is going to be legendary." Elena had nodded, already knowing her role. She'd wear something elegant, but not attention-grabbing. Smile for the cameras. Make small talk with people who wouldn't remember her name 5 minutes later. Then be seated somewhere distant and forgettable while Julian held court. But something had shifted in her during those weeks of planning. Maybe it was watching Julian obsess over every detail of the party, the menu, the music, the guest list, with more passion than he'd shown for her in years. Maybe it was the way he discussed her role in the evening, the same way he discussed the floral arrangements. Necessary, decorative, ultimately background. "I've put you at table 7, he'd said casually one evening, not looking up from the seating chart his event planner had prepared. Next to Theodore Chun, he owns half of commercial real estate in Asia, and Reginald Hartford, the oil guy. He's a bit old, but his foundation might partner with ours next year, so be charming." She'd looked at the seating chart he'd spread across their dining table. The main table where Julian would sit was a quarter-mile of mahogany positioned in the center of the ballroom, designed so everyone in the room would have a clear sight line to him. 50 seats total, arranged with military precision. Table 7 was in the back corner, practically in the kitchen. "I'm your wife," she'd said quietly. "Shouldn't I be sitting with you?" He'd finally glanced up, genuine surprise crossing his features. "Elena, the head table is for business. You understand that, right? I've got the CEO of Meridian Technologies on one side, the founder of Blackstone Capital on the other. Every seat is strategic. I need to be able to work that table, and having you there ... double quotes, he'd trailed off, but the implication was clear. You'd be a distraction. Dead weight." That was the moment Elena had made her decision. She'd spent the following weeks preparing in secret, calling in favors, reaching out to old colleagues, piecing together a plan that felt both terrifying and necessary. She'd met with lawyers, with accountants, with private investigators whose findings had made her physically ill. Julian hadn't noticed any of it. He was too consumed with his party, with his legacy, with his performance. The night of the gala, Elena had gotten ready in one of the guest bedrooms. Julian had wanted the master suite to himself to prepare, to rehearse his speech, to get into the right headspace. She'd stood before the full-length mirror in that impersonal room, looking at the woman reflected back at her. The dress she'd chosen was red. Not the subtle, elegant red that wealthy wives wear to blend in while technically standing out. This was the red of stop signs, of warning lights, of blood. It was Valentino, custom-made, cut to precision, showing exactly enough to command attention without crossing into vulgarity. She'd paired it with the diamond necklace Julian had given her for their first anniversary, but back when he still picked out her gifts himself, back when they'd still meant something. Her dark hair, usually worn in a practical bun or loose waves, was styled in an elaborate updo that had taken the stylist 3 hours to complete. Her makeup was flawless, dramatic, the kind that photographed beautifully. She looked like someone who was about to do something unforgettable. The Ashford Foundation Gala was held at the Celesta, a private mansion in the Hamptons that had been converted into an event space for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of place where the parking lot looked like a luxury car showroom, and the waitstaff had better credentials than most companies' executives. Elena had arrived separately from Julian. He'd gone early to make sure everything was perfect, which meant she'd walked into the ballroom alone, with every eye turning toward her. The room had been transformed into something from a fantasy. Crystal chandeliers the size of cars hung from the vaulted ceiling. The walls were draped in white silk and gold accents. The famous long table stretched through the center of the space like a spine set with china so delicate it seemed to whisper, with floral arrangements that cost more than most people's yearly salary, with candles casting everything in a soft golden glow that made everyone look like they belonged in a Renaissance painting. 50 seats at that table. 50 of the world's most powerful, influential, wealthy individuals, all gathered to celebrate Julian Ashford's brilliance. Elena had felt several things walking into that room: fear, determination, rage, grief. But mostly she'd felt freedom. The freedom that comes from knowing you've already lost everything, so there's nothing left to protect. She'd found her assigned seat, table 7, just as promised, tucked away in the corner where important people wouldn't have to notice her. Theodore Chun, the real estate mogul, had nodded politely when she sat down, then immediately turned back to his conversation with someone else. Reginald Hartford, the oil baron, had already been half asleep, his champagne glass listing dangerously in his age-spotted hand. From her distant vantage point, Elena had watched her husband work the room during the cocktail hour. He'd moved from cluster to cluster like a politician, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, his hand always ready to shake or pat or guide. He was in his element, feeding off the attention, the admiration, the envy. The blonde woman he'd been talking to during dinner, Victoria something, Venture capitalist, recently divorced from a tech founder, had been particularly attentive. Elena had watched them during the appetizer course, the way Victoria leaned just a little too close, the way Julian's smile became just a little more genuine, the way his body language opened toward her in a way it never opened toward his wife anymore. It should have hurt. Once upon a time, it would have destroyed her. But Elena had moved past pain into something colder and more clarifying: purpose. Dinner had been a theatrical production, each course presented with a flourish, each wine pairing announced like it was bringing good news from the front. Elena hadn't tasted any of it. She'd spent the entire meal watching, observing, noting the dynamics at the long table. She'd seen the sycophants and the genuine admirers, the friends and the competitors, the people who loved Julian and the people who were simply afraid of him. She'd watched her husband bask in it all, holding court, telling stories that people laughed at not because they were funny, but because he was Julian Ashford and laughing was expected. She'd watched him not look at her even once. Around her at table 7, Theodore Chun had discussed commercial real estate markets with the person on his other side. Reginald Hartford had woken up briefly for the main course, eaten 3 bites, then dozed off again. Nobody had asked Elena about her work, her interests, her thoughts on anything at all. She'd spent 3 hours being invisible at a party thrown by her own husband. And then, just as dessert was being served, some architectural marvel of spun sugar and gold leaf that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, Julian had stood up to give his speech. The room had fallen into that particular kind of attentive silence that powerful people command. Julian had smiled, raised his glass, and begun speaking about vision, legacy, innovation, the future he was building. He'd thanked his team, his investors, his board of directors. He'd made a self-deprecating joke that everyone laughed at. He'd painted a picture of himself as a visionary changing the world. He thanked everyone except his wife. Not even a passing mention. Not even and of course my beautiful wife Elena, thrown in for appearance's sake. She'd been so thoroughly erased from his narrative that she might as well not have existed. That was when Elena had felt the final thread of her old life snap. That was when she'd stood up. The silence that fell over the room when she rose from her seat was different from the respectful quiet that had greeted Julian's speech. This was confused, uncertain. People didn't interrupt these events, especially not wives seated at table 7 in the back corner. Elena had begun walking toward the long table, her heels clicking against the marble floor in the sudden quiet. She'd moved slowly, deliberately, her red dress catching the candlelight, her expression calm and resolved. She'd watched Julian finally notice her, watched confusion flicker across his face, then annoyance. She'd seen him try to signal her subtly to sit back down, to stop making a scene, to remember her place. She'd ignored him. She'd walked the entire length of that massive ballroom until she reached the long table, until she stood at the end opposite from where Julian sat. The 50 guests seated there had all turned to look at her now, their faces registering various degrees of curiosity, confusion, and concern. "I have something to say," she'd announced, and her voice had come out stronger than she'd expected, clear and steady and impossible to ignore. And Julian finally, after hours of ignoring her existence, had looked directly at her. "Elena," he'd said, his voice carrying that warning tone she'd heard 1,000 times before. "This isn't the time—" "No, Julian," she'd interrupted. And she'd seen shock register on his face because she'd never interrupted him in public before. She'd never contradicted him in front of his peers. "This is exactly the time. Because you've spent the last 3 hours talking about legacy, about vision, about the future you're building. But you've left out some crucial details." The room was utterly silent now. Even the waitstaff had frozen in place. Victoria, the blonde venture capitalist, had a champagne glass halfway to her lips, her expression caught somewhere between fascination and horror. Julian's jaw had tightened. "Whatever you think you're doing, I'm telling the truth," Elena had said simply. "Something that seems to have become optional in this marriage." She'd reached into the small clutch she'd been carrying, red, matching her dress, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Her hands hadn't even been shaking. "This is a financial report from a private investigator I hired 3 months ago," she'd announced, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. "Would anyone like to know what it contains?" Julian had stood up so abruptly his chair had scraped against the floor. "Elena, stop this right now. You're embarrassing yourself." "Am I?" She'd smiled then, and it hadn't been a kind smile. "That's interesting, because I think I'm just getting started with what should be embarrassing." She'd unfolded the paper with deliberate slowness, making everyone wait, building the tension like a conductor controlling an orchestra. For the past 2 years, she'd read, her voice clear and steady, Julian Ashford has been systematically moving company funds into offshore accounts. Not for tax purposes, though that's what he'd claim if anyone asked. But for something much simpler. He's planning to divorce me and wants to hide assets to avoid a fair settlement. The room had erupted in gasps and murmurs. Julian's face had gone pale, then flushed red with rage. That's a lie, he'd spat. That's complete. I have bank statements. Elena had continued, raising her voice to cut through his denial. I have emails. I have recorded conversations with your accountant, who was very helpful once I explained that obstruction of justice is a crime. Should I keep going? The murmurs had grown louder. People had been pulling out their phones, undoubtedly texting their lawyers, their business partners, their assistants. Julian's carefully constructed image was cracking in real time. But Elena hadn't been finished. That's not even the interesting part, she'd said, pulling out another document. This is a prenuptial agreement that Julian's lawyer drafted 6 months ago. Apparently he was planning to present it to me retroactively, claiming we'd signed it before our wedding and I'd just forgotten. She'd looked directly at her husband, then, her eyes cold. You were going to gaslight me into believing I agreed to leave this marriage with nothing. Victoria had set down her champagne glass. Several people at the table had exchanged glances. The former president in attendance had his phone out, probably already calling his crisis management team. Julian had moved around the table toward her, his expression dark. You have no idea what you're doing, he'd said, his voice low and dangerous. No idea who you're messing with. Actually, Elena had replied calmly, I know exactly who I'm messing with. I married him 6 years ago. I loved him. I believed in him. I built him up, supported his work, sacrificed my own career so he could build his empire. And in return, he erased me, made me invisible, treated me like a pretty accessory that could be discarded when it was no longer useful. She'd looked around at the 50 faces watching her, at the people who'd spent years kissing up to Julian, at the power structure that had enabled his behavior. But here's what Julian didn't count on, she'd continued. I'm not just a trophy wife. I'm Dr. Elena Ashford. I have a doctorate in behavioral psychology. I've published 3 books on human behavior and manipulation in relationships. And I've spent the last 6 months documenting every single instance of financial fraud, emotional abuse, and strategic deception my husband has engaged in, not just with me, but with his business partners, his investors, and yes, with at least 4 women he's had affairs with during our marriage. The room had exploded then. Not with gasps this time, but with chaos. People shouting questions, Julian shouting denials. Phones appearing from everywhere as the assembled elite realized they were witnessing either the scandal of the decade or the most spectacular self-destruction they'd ever seen. Elena had stood in the center of it all, calm as the eye of a hurricane, and waited for the noise to die down. When it finally did, when everyone was looking at her again with rapt attention, she'd spoken one more time. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow morning, she'd announced. I'm also filing criminal complaints for fraud and financial misconduct. I'm releasing all of my documentation to the press and the Sikh, and I'm starting a foundation to support women who've been erased and abused by powerful men who think they untouchable. She'd pulled out one final document. This one she didn't unfold, just held it up so everyone could see the official letterhead. This is a letter from the board of directors at Ashford Technologies, she'd said. It's addressed to Julian. It's an emergency motion calling for his removal as CEO, citing concerns about his judgment, his ethics, and his ability to lead. It was drafted yesterday after I met with 3 of your board members and showed them everything I found. Julian had looked like he'd been hit by a truck. You met with my board? I did, Elena had confirmed. Turns out when you've been ignoring your wife for years, she has a lot of free time to build alliances with people who've been wanting to remove you but never had sufficient cause. Until now, she'd set all the papers down on the table in front of her, straightened her posture, and looked at her husband one last time. You wanted to build a legacy, Julian. Congratulations, you have. You we've remembered as the brilliant CEO who was so consumed with his own importance that he destroyed everything, his marriage, his company, his reputation, because he forgot that the people he dismissed as irrelevant were actually paying attention the whole time. Then she'd turn to walk away, her red dress swishing behind her, her head held high. She'd made it 3 steps before Julian had grabbed her arm. You bitch, he'd hissed, his carefully cultivated charm completely stripped away to reveal the rage underneath. You ungrateful, vindictive. Elena had looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. There are 50 witnesses here, Julian. Along with 4 photographers and 2 videographers you hired to document your triumph. I'd suggest you let go of me before you add assault to your growing list of problems. He'd released her arm like it had burned him. She'd continued walking across that massive ballroom, past the shocked faces and the clicking phones, past the life she'd built with a man who'd forgotten she was human. She'd reached the exit, pushed open the door, and stepped out into the night air, finally free. Behind her, she'd heard the chaos erupting in full force. Questions being shouted, accusations being hurled, Julian's voice trying to regain control and failing spectacularly. Elena had smiled then, a real smile, maybe the first genuine one she'd worn in years. She'd been invisible for so long, but now, finally, she'd been impossible to ignore. The next morning, Elena woke up in a hotel suite overlooking Central Park, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. The suite was nothing compared to the penthouse she'd shared with Julian, smaller, simpler, without the floor-to-ceiling windows that had always made her feel like she was living in a glass display case. But it was hers. She'd paid for it with her own credit card, the one tied to her book royalties that Julian had always dismissed as play money. She'd slept deeply, dreamlessly, the kind of sleep that comes after a fever breaks. Now, sitting on the edge of the bed with weak morning sunlight filtering through the curtains, she picked up her phone for the first time since leaving the gala. She'd turned it off in the car, not wanting to deal with the inevitable fallout until she was ready. The screen lit up with a cascade of notifications that seemed endless. Texts, emails, missed calls, voicemails, hundreds of them. Her phone had essentially exploded overnight. She scrolled through them methodically, her coffee growing cold on the nightstand beside her. Messages from old colleagues. Elena, I saw the video. Are you okay? This is incredibly brave. Messages from journalists. Dr. Ashford, I'd love to discuss an exclusive interview about last night's events. Messages from lawyers. We specialize in high-profile divorce cases. We'd be honored to represent you. Messages from women she'd never met. Thank you for what you did. You spoke for all of us. And then, buried among the supportive messages and the opportunistic ones, there were messages from Julian's circle. Some were threats thinly veiled as concern. Some were attempts at manipulation. Julian is devastated. He never meant to hurt you. Surely you can work this out privately. Some were simply rage. You've destroyed a great man over your own insecurities. She deleted those without reading them fully. There were 17 voicemails from Julian himself. She listened to the first one. Elena. His voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when he was trying very hard not to lose his temper. I don't know what you think you've accomplished, but you've made a terrible mistake. Call me. We need to discuss this like adults before you do something you'll regret. The second voicemail was less controlled. Pick up your goddamn phone. Do you have any idea what you've done? The board is calling an emergency meeting. Our stock dropped 6 points overnight. Call me back now. By the 7th voicemail, his voice had shifted into something that might have been pleading if it hadn't been so laced with desperation. Elena, please. We can fix this. I know I haven't been perfect, but we can work through this together. Just to just call me back. Tell me where you are. She didn't listen to the rest. Instead, she opened her laptop and did what she'd been avoiding. She looked at the news. The headlines were everywhere. Tech billionaire Julian Ashford exposed by wife in shocking public revelation. Ashford Technologies in crisis as CEO faces fraud allegations. The Red Dress Rebellion, how Dr. Elena Ashford became an overnight icon. There was video, of course. Multiple angles, posted by guests who'd been filming the whole thing. She watched herself stand up in that red dress. Watched herself walk the length of that ballroom with her head high. Watched herself speak truth into a room full of people who made their fortunes on carefully constructed lies. In the video, she looked powerful, unshakable, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. She barely recognized herself. The comment sections were, predictably, a war zone. Half the internet was calling her a hero, a warrior, an inspiration. The other half was calling her a gold digger, a vindictive wife, a woman scorned seeking revenge. She destroyed a man's life because she was jealous. She exposed a fraud because she had receipts. This is what feminism has become, tearing down successful men. This is what accountability looks like when someone finally demands it. Elena closed the laptop. She didn't need the internet's approval or condemnation. She'd known when she stood up at that table that she'd be judged, dissected, analyzed from every angle. That was the price of visibility. She decided it was worth paying. Her lawyer arrived at the hotel at 10 a.m. sharp. Rebecca Moss was everything Julian's attorneys were not. Direct, no nonsense, and genuinely interested in justice rather than just billable hours. Elena had found her through one of her old colleagues, a professor who'd been through a difficult divorce herself. "You've certainly made my job more interesting," Rebecca said, settling into one of the suite's armchairs with her briefcase. She was in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "I've been practicing family law for 30 years, and I've never had a case that made national news before the papers were even filed. I wanted to control the narrative," Elena explained, pouring them both coffee from the room service tray she'd ordered. "If I'd filed quietly, Julian would have used his connections to bury everything. The press would have covered it as troubled marriage or irreconcilable differences. No one would have known what he actually did." "Smart," Rebecca acknowledged. "Risky as hell, but smart. You've essentially guaranteed that every move he makes will be scrutinized. He can't make evidence disappear when the world is watching. That was the idea." Rebecca opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been reviewing the documentation you sent me. The financial records, the emails, the recorded conversations. Elena, this is comprehensive, doesn't even begin to cover it. How long did you spend gathering all this?" 6 months, Elena said. "Ever since I realized he was planning to leave me with nothing. I started paying attention to everything, his meetings, his phone calls, his travel schedule. I created fake email accounts to communicate with sources so nothing could be traced back to me. I met with his disgruntled former employees, his business rivals, even the private investigator he'd hired, to dig up dirt on a competitor who was more than happy to turn on Julian once I explained what I was looking for and why." Rebecca was quiet for a moment, studying her. "You know what you remind me of? A therapist I used to see years ago? She told me once that the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who act on impulse. They're the ones who wait, who observe, who gather information methodically and then strike when the time is right." "My doctoral thesis was on strategic patience and conflict resolution," Elena said with a slight smile. "I wrote about how people in powerless positions often develop sophisticated observation skills as a survival mechanism. They learn to read rooms, anticipate behavior, gather leverage quietly. Julian never read my thesis. His loss," Rebecca said dryly. "Our gain. Now, let's talk about what happens next." The divorce filing made headlines within hours. Elena had anticipated this. The media was already circling like sharks, and the official court documents were public record. But seeing the coverage was still surreal. Dr. Elena Ashford files for divorce, seeks $480 million in settlement. The number looked obscene in print. Half of Julian's estimated net worth, which various financial outlets had pegged at just under $1 billion. Elena didn't actually care about the money. She had her own career, her own income, her own path forward. But Rebecca had been insistent. "You're entitled to it," her lawyer had explained. "You were married for 6 years during the period when his company experienced its most explosive growth. New York is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets get divided fairly. And fair in this case means you get half. More importantly, asking for a large settlement sends a message. You're not going to be intimidated into accepting less than you deserve, so they'd asked for half. And they'd itemized every single thing Julian had done to try to hide assets. Every offshore account, every shell company, every suspicious transfer. The filing was 47 pages long and read like a thriller. By noon, Elena's phone was ringing with interview requests from every major media outlet. Good Morning America, The Today Show, CNN, 60 Minutes. Even international press, the BBC, Le Monde, Der Spiegel. Apparently, a woman publicly dismantling her billionaire husband's empire was international news. You don't have to do any of them, Rebecca advised. In fact, from a legal strategy perspective, staying silent might be smarter. Let the documents speak for themselves. But Elena had thought about this too. If I stay silent, Julian controls the narrative. He'll go on TV, play the victim, paint me as a woman scorned or mentally unstable or whatever story his PR team spins. I need people to see me, hear me speak. Understand that this isn't about revenge, it's about accountability. Rebecca had studied her for a long moment. You're not just divorcing your husband, are you? You're trying to change something bigger. I'm trying to show women that being erased doesn't have to be permanent, Elena said. That you can take back your voice, even when it feels impossible. So she'd accepted one interview. Just one, but the biggest one, 60 Minutes, airing that Sunday, 3 days away. Julian, meanwhile, was imploding spectacularly. Elena didn't take any pleasure in this, or at least, she told herself she didn't. But it was hard not to feel a grim satisfaction watching the empire he devalued above everything else begin to crumble. The board of Ashford Technologies had indeed called an emergency meeting. Elena knew this because 3 of the board members she'd met with had been texting her updates. They'd voted 7-4 to place Julian on immediate administrative leave pending an investigation into the fraud allegations. His company's stock had dropped 15% in 2 days. His biggest investors were demanding meetings. 3 of his business partners had publicly distanced themselves from him. The blonde venture capitalist, Victoria, had given a statement to the press. I was simply networking with Mr. Ashford in a professional capacity. Any suggestion of impropriety is completely unfounded, which everyone correctly interpreted as, I'm running as fast as I can from this sinking ship. Julian had hired a crisis management team and a legal army. He'd released a statement calling Elena's allegations baseless and defamatory, claiming he was the victim of a vindictive spouse's fantasy. But the evidence was public now. The financial records, the emails, the documentation, Elena had released all of it to the press and the SEC simultaneously. You couldn't call something a fantasy when there were bank statements and recorded conversations backing it up. Still, Julian fought, of course he did. Men like him always fought, because admitting fault was impossible for them. Admitting fault meant admitting they weren't the heroes of their own stories. On Thursday morning, Elena woke to headlines announcing that Julian had called his own press conference. She watched it from her hotel room, Rebecca sitting beside her with a legal pad, taking notes. Julian looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. He stood at a podium in front of his company's headquarters, flanked by 2 attorneys, facing a sea of cameras and reporters. I want to address the allegations that have been made against me, he began, his voice strained. First, let me be clear, I have never engaged in financial fraud. Every transaction, every account, every business decision I've made has been legal and properly documented. My wife's accusations are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how corporate finance works. A reporter shouted a question. What about the offshore accounts? Completely legal, Julian snapped. Used for legitimate business purposes, all properly reported. Next question. What about the affairs? His jaw tightened. My personal life is not relevant to these proceedings. This is a business matter being manipulated into tabloid fodder by someone who is angry about the end of our marriage. So you're admitting the marriage is over? I'm admitting that my wife has chosen to end our relationship in the most destructive way possible, and I'm deeply saddened by that choice. Elena made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something sharper. On screen, another reporter asked, Mr. Ashford, your wife is a respected psychologist with multiple published books. Do you believe she's lying about everything? Julian had paused then, and Elena saw something flicker across his face, genuine confusion, maybe even hurt. As if he truly couldn't understand how the woman he dismissed and ignored had somehow orchestrated his downfall. I think my wife is having a breakdown, he said finally, and his voice carried a note of what might have been intended as compassion, but came across as condescension. I think the pressure of being married to someone in my position became too much for her, and rather than seek help, she's lashing out. I've tried to reach her to offer support, but she's refused all contact. I hope she gets the help she needs. Rebecca had turned to Elena with raised eyebrows. He's really going with the she's crazy defense? Of course he is, Elena said quietly. It's the oldest playbook in history. When a woman speaks truth about a powerful man, question her sanity. Too bad for him you've got a doctorate in psychology and no history of mental illness. That angle's not going to work. On screen, the press conference was wrapping up. Julian was refusing to take more questions. His lawyers were ushering him away, and the reporters were shouting after him. Elena turned off the TV. He really doesn't get it, she said, more to herself than to Rebecca. He still thinks this is something he can spin, some PR problem he can solve. He doesn't understand that I'm not playing his game anymore. The 60 Minutes interview was filmed on Saturday in a studio in Manhattan. The interviewer was Catherine Wright, a journalist known for her tough but fair approach. Someone who didn't let anyone powerful men or anyone else off the hook with easy answers. Elena had prepared extensively, working with Rebecca to anticipate every possible question, every angle of attack. But when the camera started rolling and Catherine leaned forward with that intense, focused gaze, Elena found that she didn't need her rehearsed answers. She just needed to tell the truth. "Dr. Ashford," Catherine began, "you've become the center of one of the biggest scandals in recent memory. Your husband is calling you vindictive and claiming you're having a breakdown. What do you say to that?" Elena met her gaze steadily. "I say that's exactly what I expected him to say. Because acknowledging the truth that he systematically devalued, erased, and manipulated me for years would require him to see me as a person rather than as an object he owned. And Julian has never been very good at seeing people. Take us back. When did you realize your marriage was in trouble?" "I think the marriage was in trouble long before I realized it," Elena said carefully. "The signs were gradual. A canceled dinner here, a forgotten anniversary there, a slow shift from partnership to decoration. I kept telling myself he was just busy, that building a billion-dollar company required sacrifices. It took me too long to understand that all the sacrifices were supposed to be mine. You're a psychologist. Why didn't you see it sooner?" Elena smiled slightly. "That's the question I've asked myself 1,000 times. And I think the answer is that it's very hard to diagnose your own situation when you're reliving inside it. I could see the patterns clearly in my research, in my patients, in case studies. But when it's your own life, your own marriage, your own husband looking at you like you're invisible, it's just easier to doubt yourself than to confront the reality that the person you love doesn't really see you anymore." "When did you decide to gather evidence?" "The moment I discovered he was planning to leave me with nothing. I found documents in his office drafts of a retroactive prenuptial agreement, financial statements showing assets being moved. And I realized he'd been planning this for months, maybe years. He was going to divorce me, take everything, and make me feel like I'd never contributed anything to his success. That must have been devastating." "It was," Elena acknowledged. "But it was also clarifying. Because I realized that if I stayed in the victim role, if I just let him do this to me, I would spend the rest of my life being erased. Not just from his narrative, but from my own. So I decided to fight back. Not with emotion or dramatics, but with documentation and truth." Catherine leaned forward. "Some people are calling what you did at the gala a publicity stunt. How do you respond?" "I call it speaking truth in a room full of people who've profited from lies," Elena said simply. "Could I have filed for divorce quietly?" "Yes." "Would anyone have paid attention?" "No. Julian would have used his money and connections to bury the evidence, settle quietly, and move on with his reputation intact while I disappeared into obscurity. I chose to speak publicly because silence has never protected women. Silence has only ever protected powerful men. You've become a symbol for a lot of women. Does that feel like a responsibility?" Elena was quiet for a moment, considering. "It feels like an opportunity. I've spent my entire career studying power dynamics in relationships, writing about emotional manipulation and strategic devaluation. I've advised countless women on how to recognize these patterns, but I never expected to become a case study myself. If my experience can help even one woman recognize that she deserves better, that her voice matters, that being erased isn't permanent, then everything I've been through will have been worth it." "What do you want people to understand about your situation?" "I want people to understand that this isn't about a billionaire and his wife having marital problems. This is about a pattern of behavior that happens at every economic level: men who view their partners as accessories, who erase women's contributions, who take credit for shared successes and assign blame for any failures. It happens in trailer parks and penthouse suites. The only difference is that when it happens in public, with enough money and power involved, people actually pay attention." "And what's next for you?" Elena smiled then, a real smile, full of something that looked like hope. "I am starting a foundation to support women transitioning out of relationships where they've then been devalued or erased. I'm going back to my research. I'm writing a 4th book about my experience. And I'm living my life on my own terms, which is something I haven't done in longer than I cared to admit. Do you have any regrets?" "Only one," Elena said quietly. "I regret that it took me so long to remember who I was before Julian Ashford made me forget." The interview aired Sunday night and was watched by 23 million people. By Monday morning, Elena had become something she never expected: a cultural phenomenon. #ElenaAshford was trending on every social media platform. Women were sharing their own stories of being erased, dismissed, devalued. Support groups were forming. Think pieces were being written about power, gender, visibility, and voice. But there was also backlash. Death threats in her inbox. Conservative commentators calling her a destroyer of families. Men's rights groups claiming she was weaponizing victimhood. Elena had expected this too. You couldn't challenge power structures without power fighting back. Rebecca called Monday afternoon with news. Julian's legal team is requesting mediation. They want to settle. Already? The public pressure is too much. His board is threatening to remove him permanently if he doesn't resolve this quickly. His investors are nervous. And apparently 2 of the women you mentioned having affairs with have come forward with their own stories. He's hemorrhaging credibility by the hour. Elena was quiet, processing this. Victory shouldn't feel this hollow, but somehow it did. What are they offering? Full disclosure of all assets, a fair 50-50 split, and a mutual non-disparagement agreement moving forward. Plus, he'll issue a public apology acknowledging that he failed as a husband. He'll never agree to the apology. He already did. His lawyers are drafting it now. Elena sat down on the hotel bed, suddenly exhausted. I thought it would feel different, she said quietly. Winning. It's not really about winning, Rebecca said gently. It's about getting what you deserved all along: respect, acknowledgement, and a fair chance to move forward. The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later in a conference room that felt sterile and impersonal. Nothing like the warm, intimate wedding venue where she and Julian had made promises neither of them had kept. Julian looked diminished somehow, smaller than he'd been at the gala. His attorneys flanked him protectively, as if Elena might suddenly attack. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. They signed papers in silence. Elena's hand was steady. I want you to know, Julian said suddenly, breaking the quiet. I never meant to hurt you. Elena looked up at him, this man she'd loved, this stranger she'd married. Yes, you did, she said calmly. Maybe not consciously, maybe not with malice. But you made choices every single day to prioritize yourself over our marriage, your ego over my humanity. You meant to hurt me, you just didn't think it mattered. He flinched like she'd slapped him. For what it's worth, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry. Not because my lawyers told me to say it, but because it's true. I loved you once. I think I forgot how. I loved you too, Elena acknowledged. But love isn't enough when respect is missing. And you stopped respecting me long before you stopped loving me. They finished signing. Shook hands like business partners. Walked out of the conference room into separate lives. 6 months later, Elena stood in front of 200 women at the inaugural conference for the Visibility Foundation, the nonprofit she started with a portion of her divorce settlement. The conference was being held in a hotel ballroom that was smaller and more intimate than the Celesta, but somehow felt more significant. These weren't billionaires and power players. They were teachers and nurses and accountants and artists. Women who'd been erased in relationships and workplaces and families. Women who'd found the courage to speak up, to walk away, to reclaim their voices. Elena had worried she wouldn't know what to say to them. That her experience was too unique, too public, too different from theirs. But when she stepped up to the microphone and looked out at those 200 faces, women of all ages and backgrounds, all carrying their own stories of invisibility and resurgence, she found that the words came easily. A year ago, she began, I was invisible. Not literally, of course people could see me physically. But I'd been erased in every way that mattered. My voice, my work, my identity, all of it, had been slowly, systematically deleted by a man who I'd trusted to be my partner. The room was silent, attentive. I want you to understand something important, Elena continued. What happened to me wasn't unique. The setting was unusual, a billionaire's gala instead of a living room, international headlines instead of quiet suffering. But the pattern was the same pattern that happens to millions of women. We're told we're too sensitive. We're told we're imagining things. We're told we should be grateful for what we have. We're slowly trained to doubt our own reality until we become ghosts in our own lives. She paused, letting that sink in. But here's what I learned through my experience and what I want you to take away from today. Visibility is a choice. Not always an easy one, not always a safe one. But it's a choice we can make. We can choose to speak truth even when our voices shake. We can choose to document evidence even when we're afraid. We can choose to walk away from situations that are erasing us, even when walking away feels impossible. The foundation we're launching today isn't just about financial support. though we'll provide that for women transitioning out of difficult situations. It's about creating a network of visibility, a place where women's stories are believed, where their experiences are validated, where their voices matter. Because the opposite of being erased isn't being famous. It's simply being seen. The applause that followed was deafening. Later that evening, Elena returned to her apartment, not the penthouse she'd shared with Julian, but a smaller place in Brooklyn that she'd chosen herself. It had exposed brick and tall windows and a view of the East River that made her feel connected to the city rather than hovering above it. She made herself dinner, a simple pasta dish, nothing fancy, and ate it at her small kitchen table while reading submissions for her fourth book. Women had sent her thousands of stories after the 60 Minutes interview, and she was compiling them, with permission, into a collective narrative about invisibility and reclamation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Saw your speech online. You're doing something important. Proud of you." Another text, this one from her sister in California. "You're changing lives, Elena, including your own." And one more, from a woman she'd never met. "I left my husband today after 15 years of being invisible. Your story gave me courage. Thank you." Elena set down her phone and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the water. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, the one sitting in the back corner of that ballroom, watching her husband ignore her existence, believing she deserved to be erased. She thought about the moment she'd stood up from that table, how terrified and certain she'd felt simultaneously. She thought about everything she'd lost: her marriage, her old life, the safety of invisibility. And she thought about everything she'd gained: her voice, her purpose, her sense of self. The trade, she decided, had been worth it. Julian had faded from the headlines relatively quickly. He'd stepped down from his CEO position, maintained a seat on the board, but with significantly reduced influence. His company had survived the scandal but was permanently changed, more transparent, more accountable, less reliant on the cult of personality he'd built around himself. He'd tried to call her once, about 4 months after the divorce was finalized. She'd let it go to voicemail. "Elena," his message had said, and his voice had sounded old, tired. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I've been in therapy, real therapy, not PR damage control, and I'm starting to understand things I should have understood years ago. About power, about control, about how I treated you. I just wanted to say you were right. About all of it. I erased you because I could, because it was easier than treating you as an equal. Because somewhere along the way I'd convinced myself that my success mattered more than your humanity. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything. But it's true." She'd saved the message but never responded. Some apologies deserved acknowledgement, but not absolution. Julian would have to live with what he'd done, just as she'd had to live with being erased. The difference was that she'd found a way to become visible again. He was still learning how to see. A year after the gala, Elena gave a TED Talk that went viral. She'd been nervous about it. TED Talks felt different from academic conferences or foundation speeches. The format demanded both vulnerability and precision, personal story and universal truth. But when she walked onto that red circle and looked out at the audience, she felt the same calm clarity she'd felt standing up at Julian's table. "I'm going to tell you about the night I became visible," she began. "But first, I need to tell you about all the years I spent disappearing." She spoke for 18 minutes. She told her story, but she also told the story of every woman who'd been systematically erased by someone who claimed to love them. She talked about the psychology of invisibility, the mechanisms of power, the cost of silence. And she ended with a call to action. If you're someone who's being erased in a relationship, at work, in your family, I want you to know that visibility is possible. It's not easy. It might cost you things you value. But the alternative, spending your life as a ghost in your own story, costs you even more. And if you someone who has the power to make others invisible, whether you're aware of it or not, I'm asking you to stop. Look at the people around you. Really look at them. Listen to them. Acknowledge their humanity. Because power isn't about how many people you can control or diminish. Real power is about how many people you can elevate. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. 2 years after the gala, Elena received an email that made her pause. It was from Victoria, the blonde venture capitalist who'd been flirting with Julian that night. "Dr. Ashford, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from. I've debated sending this email for months, but I think I need to say this. That night at the gala, I was one of many women who enabled your husband's behavior. I saw how he ignored you, how he treated you like you were decoration rather than a person. And I didn't say anything. Worse, I actively participated in your erasure by competing for his attention, by treating you as irrelevant. I told myself at the time that it was just business. That charming, powerful man was part of networking. That his marriage wasn't my responsibility. But watching what you did, watching you stand up and reclaim your voice made me realize I'd been complicit in a system that erases women. Not just you, but countless others. I'd been in rooms where men dismissed their wives, their female employees, their colleagues. And I stayed silent because speaking up might have cost me access, opportunities, power. I'm trying to do better now. I've started calling out erasure when I see it. I've been funding women-led ventures exclusively. I've been examining my own behavior and the ways I've internalized misogyny. I know this doesn't undo anything. But I wanted you to know that you changed me too. Thank you for your courage. Victoria Elena read the email twice, then a third time. She thought about responding, about accepting the apology or rejecting it or engaging in some kind of dialogue. In the end, she simply wrote, "Thank you for telling me this. Keep doing better, because that was all any of them could do, really. Keep doing better. Keep choosing visibility over erasure, truth over comfort, courage over complicity." 5 years after the gala, Elena published her fourth book, Invisible, The Psychology of Erasure and the Power of Reclamation. It became a bestseller within weeks. Not because of the scandal it documented, but because it spoke to something universal. Everyone, regardless of gender, had experienced moments of feeling erased, dismissed, rendered invisible by someone with more power. The book tour took her across the country, then internationally. Everywhere she went, people lined up to share their stories, of finally leaving toxic relationships, of speaking up at work, of refusing to be diminished anymore. In London, a woman in her 60s told Elena, "I've been invisible in my marriage for 40 years. After reading your book, I asked my husband for couples therapy. He said no, so I asked for a divorce instead. At 63 years old, I'm finally choosing myself." In Tokyo, a young tech worker described standing up in a meeting where her ideas had been repeatedly dismissed and claiming credit for her own work, loudly and clearly for the first time. In Sao Paulo, a teacher explained how she used Elena's framework to help students recognize and resist being erased by bullies, by parents, by social pressures. Each story added to the collective narrative. Visibility was contagious. One person choosing to be seen gave others permission to do the same. 7 years after the gala, Elena received an unexpected package. Inside was a letter and a large check, made out to the Visibility Foundation. The letter was from Julian. "Elena, I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness, or to explain myself, or to insert myself back into your life in any way. I'm writing because I want to contribute to the work you're doing. I've spent the last 7 years in intensive therapy, trying to understand how I became the kind of man who could erase someone I claimed to love. The answers haven't been comfortable. I was raised to believe that success justified any sacrifice. That power was the only thing that mattered, that people were resources to be managed, rather than humans to be respected. I built an empire by treating people, including and especially you, as means to my ends. I can't undo that. I can't give you back the years I took, the voice I silenced, the person you had to fight to become visible again. But I can try to ensure that the work you're doing reaches more women. This donation is a start. I don't expect thanks or acknowledgement. I just want to support something meaningful, even if I can't be part of it. You were right about everything. I hope you know that." Julian Elena stared at the check for a long time. It was enough to fund the foundation for 3 years, to expand their programs, to reach thousands more women. Part of her wanted to tear it up, to refuse his money, to tell him that he couldn't buy redemption. But another part of her, the part that had learned about strategic pragmatism, about using whatever resources were available to create change, recognized that this wasn't about Julian's redemption, it was about the women the foundation could help. She deposited the check. She didn't respond to his letter. Some debts couldn't be repaid, but resources could still be redirected toward good. 10 years after the gala, Elena was invited back to speak at a psychology conference at the same university where she'd earned her doctorate. She almost said no, she'd moved beyond the academic world in many ways, her work now more focused on practical application than theoretical research. But something about returning to where her journey had started felt appropriate. The lecture hall was packed. Students, faculty, professionals from across the country. She'd been asked to speak about her research on visibility and power dynamics, but also about her personal experience, how theory and lived experience had intersected in ways she never could have anticipated. Standing at the podium, looking out at the audience, Elena thought about the woman she'd been 20 years ago, earning her degree, full of idealistic certainty that understanding human behavior could change the world. That woman had been right, just not in the way she'd expected. I spent the first part of my career studying how people become invisible, she began. I wrote papers, conducted research, published findings about the mechanisms of erasure in relationships and institutions. I thought I understood it intellectually. Then I lived it. And I learned that understanding something academically and experiencing it personally are entirely different kinds of knowledge. She paused, letting the weight of that settle. But here's what I also learned. Invisibility is never permanent unless we accept it as such. We have more power than we think, not always the power to change other people, but always the power to choose whether we remain erased or whether we reclaim our voices. The real question, Elena continued, her voice carrying across the lecture hall, isn't how we become invisible. It's what we do with visibility once we reclaim it. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a simple graph, a rising curve that represented the foundation's growth over the past decade. 10 years ago, the Visibility Foundation helped 32 women transition out of situations where they'd been erased. Last year, we helped over 14,000. We've expanded to 23 countries. We've trained over 500 therapists in recognizing and addressing erasure dynamics. We've created legal resources, financial literacy programs, career transition services. A hand went up in the audience. Elena nodded toward a young woman in the third row. Dr. Ashford, do you ever worry that your story overshadows the work? That people focus on the spectacle of what happened at the gala rather than the actual mission of the foundation? Elena smiled. It was a question she'd been asked before, and one she appreciated for its thoughtfulness. I used to worry about that constantly, she admitted. In the early years, I felt like I was trapped between two identities, the woman who made a scene at a Billionaire vest party, and the psychologist trying to do serious work. I worried that the viral moment would define me forever, that I'd become a caricature rather than a person. She paused, remembering those early years of constant scrutiny, of being reduced to headlines and hashtags. But then I realized something important. The spectacle was never separate from the work. It was the work. Because erasure happens in silence, in private moments where no witnesses exist to validate your reality. What I did at that gala was refuse the silence. I made erasure visible, literally and metaphorically. And that visibility created a permission structure for other women to do the same. The young woman nodded thoughtfully, and Elena continued. The foundation doesn't exist despite the spectacle. It exists because of it. Because sometimes, the only way to challenge systems built on silence is to refuse to be quiet. After the lecture, during the reception, a woman approached Elena. She was in her 40s, well-dressed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested professional success. Dr. Ashford, I'm Sarah Chun. I was at the gala that night. Elena felt a small jolt of surprise. 10 years later, she still occasionally met people who'd been in that ballroom, who'd witnessed the moment that changed her life. I was sitting at table 4, Sarah continued, her voice quiet but steady. I was there with my husband. He's a tech investor, one of Julian's associates. And I want you to know watching you stand up that night changed my life too. How so? Sarah glanced around, making sure they had relative privacy in the bustling reception. I've been invisible in my own marriage for 15 years. My husband treated me exactly the way Julian treated you, like an accessory, like someone whose only value was in how I reflected on him. I'd convinced myself it was fine, that it was the cost of the lifestyle we had, that I should be grateful. She paused, her eyes bright with emotion. But watching you walk the length of that ballroom, watching you speak truth to your husband in front of all those powerful people, it broke something open in me. I realized I'd been making myself smaller and smaller, disappearing a little more each day, and I'd been telling myself it was a choice. That I was being mature, practical, reasonable. What did you do? Elena asked gently. I filed for divorce 6 months later. It took me that long to gather the courage, to put together my own documentation, to prepare. My husband was shocked. He genuinely had no idea I was unhappy. That's how invisible I'd become. He couldn't even see my suffering because he'd stopped seeing me as a person years ago. Sarah smiled then, a real smile full of hard-won peace. I'm remarried now to someone who actually sees me. I started my own consulting business. I volunteer with the foundation's local chapter. And I've never been happier or more myself. Elena felt the familiar swell of emotion that came with these stories, gratitude, validation, a sense of purpose that transcended her own experience. Thank you for telling me, she said, meaning it deeply. These stories, they're why I keep doing this work. That evening, back in her hotel room, Elena video called her daughter. Sophia was 8 years old now, born 3 years after the divorce from a relationship that had been everything her marriage to Julian had been: respectful, equal, built on genuine partnership. That relationship hadn't lasted. Sometimes love isn't enough, even when respect is present. But she and Sophia's father had remained close friends and devoted co-parents. Mama! Sophia's face filled the screen, gap-toothed and grinning. Did you do your speech? I did. It went really well. Did you tell them about the red dress? Elena laughed. Sophia was fascinated by the story of the gala, though Elena had edited it carefully for age appropriateness. Her daughter knew that Mama had once been married to someone who didn't treat her kindly, and that Mama had been brave and left, and that now Mama helped other people be brave too. I mentioned it briefly. But mostly I talked about the work we're doing now. The helping work, Sophia said seriously. She'd grown up surrounded by the foundation, by women's stories of reclamation and resilience. It had shaped her worldview in ways Elena was only beginning to understand. Exactly. The helping work. They talked for another 20 minutes about Sophia's day at school, about her soccer practice, about the book she was reading. Normal things. Beautiful things. The kind of everyday moments that Elena had once thought she'd have to sacrifice for career success, until she'd learned that the right life didn't require such sacrifices. After they hung up, Elena sat quietly in the hotel room, thinking about legacy. Julian had wanted to build a legacy through his company, through wealth and power and influence. He'd achieved it. In a way, his company still existed, still employed thousands of people, still innovated in meaningful ways. But Elena had built something different. A legacy of visibility, of voice, of women refusing to be erased. It wasn't measured in stock prices or market share. It was measured in lives changed, in courage found, in women who woke up one day and decided they deserved to be seen. She thought that was a better legacy. The next morning, Elena had breakfast with Dr. Margaret Reynolds, her former doctoral advisor, and the woman who'd first encouraged her to study erasure dynamics in relationships. Margaret was 72 now, retired from active teaching but still sharp as ever, still engaged with the field she'd devoted her life to. I've been thinking about your work, Margaret said, cutting into her eggs with precision. About how it's evolved from academic research into something more activist, I suppose. Does that concern you? Elena asked, genuinely curious. Some of her former colleagues had criticized her for abandoning pure research for advocacy. Concern me? God, no. It delights me. Margaret smiled, her eyes crinkling. I spent 40 years in academia studying human behavior from a distance, publishing papers that maybe 300 people read. You took that research and made it matter to millions. You made it actionable. That's not a departure from scholarship, it's the fulfillment of it. She paused, taking a sip of coffee. I will say, though, that I worry about you sometimes. The burden of visibility, of being a symbol rather than just a person. That takes a toll. Elena nodded slowly. It was true, there were days when the weight of being Elena Ashford, the woman who stood up to her billionaire husband, felt crushing. Days when she wanted to be anonymous, private, just another person living her life without scrutiny. I've learned to separate Elena the symbol from Elena the person, she said. The symbol belongs to the public, to the movement, to the women who need to see that standing up is possible. But the person, the mother, the friend, the woman who sometimes eats ice cream for dinner and watches bad reality TV, that person is still mine. That's wisdom, Margaret said approvingly. Hold on to that distinction. Don't let the symbol consume the person. Later that week, Elena received an email that made her pause. It was from a journalist working on a retrospective piece about the gala, about the decade that had followed, about how the landscape of visibility and accountability had changed. But what caught her attention was a particular paragraph. Julian Ashford has agreed to an on-the-record interview about the events of that night and their aftermath. He's expressed interest in speaking with you as well, if you're willing. He says he has things he'd like to say that he hasn't been able to express through letters or donations. No pressure, of course. I understand if that's not something you're interested in. But I wanted to extend the offer. Elena stared at the screen for a long time. She hadn't spoken directly to Julian in 10 years. They'd communicated through lawyers, through brief acknowledgments when he sent donations, but never face-to-face, never voice-to-voice. Part of her wanted to refuse immediately. What could he possibly say now that would matter? What conversation could they have that would change anything? But another part of her, the psychologist, the researcher, the woman who'd built a career on understanding human behavior, was curious. She wrote back, "I'll consider it. Give me a week to think about it." That night, Elena walked through Central Park alone, thinking. The park was beautiful in early autumn, the leaves just beginning to turn, the air carrying that particular crispness that promised change. She'd always done her best thinking while walking, her mind freed by movement. What would she say to Julian if she agreed to speak with him? What would she want to hear? She realized with some surprise that she wasn't angry anymore. That fierce, burning rage that had fueled her during those 6 months of gathering evidence, that had carried her through the gala and the divorce and the early years of the foundation, it had transformed into something else. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of settled peace. Julian had been one chapter in her story, but not the defining one. She'd let that night at the gala define her for a while because it had been necessary, because it had opened doors and created opportunities and sparked a movement. But she was more than that night. More than the woman in the red dress. More than the viral moment. More than the wronged wife who'd fought back. She was a mother, a researcher, an advocate, a friend. She was someone who'd been broken and had rebuilt herself into something stronger. She was someone who'd taken her pain and transformed it into purpose. Maybe that's what she'd want Julian to understand if they spoke, that he hadn't destroyed her. He'd tried to erase her, but she'd refused to disappear. And in refusing, she'd helped countless others refuse as well. That felt like enough. More than enough. Elena pulled out her phone and sent a text to Rebecca, her lawyer and friend. "The journalist wants to set up a conversation between Julian and me. Should I do it?" The response came quickly, "Only if you want to. You don't owe him anything, not closure, not absolution, not a conversation. What would you get out of it?" Elena thought about that as she continued walking. What would she get out of it? Maybe nothing. Maybe confirmation of what she already knew, that people could change, or at least try to, but that change didn't erase harm, or maybe something unexpected. Maybe a different kind of closure, not the kind that came from forgiveness, but the kind that came from bearing witness to someone else's reckoning with themselves. She texted back, "I think I might want to do it. Not for him, for me. To see who he's become and to show him who I've become. To close the loop." "Then do it," Rebecca responded. "Just remember, you're not the same woman who walked out of that ballroom 10 years ago. You're someone who's built something remarkable from the ruins of that marriage. Walk into that conversation knowing your own worth." Elena smiled. She did know her worth now. It had taken years to rebuild, to rediscover, but she knew it, and that knowledge made her unbreakable. She texted the journalist back, "I'll do it. Set it up." Then she put her phone away and kept walking through the park toward whatever came next, visible and certain and free.